I'm 81. I spent 40 years being a good provider. I'm only now realizing I was a stranger in my own home. My youngest daughter said something to me at Christmas 2 years ago that I have not been able to put down since. She said, "Dad, I know everything about what you did for us and almost nothing about who you are." My name is Frank. I'm 81 years old, and I have been sitting with those 14 words ever since, turning them over the way you turn something small and heavy in your hand, trying to find the angle that makes it easier to hold. I want to tell you how a man gets to 81 years old and hears something like that from his own child and understands, in the part of himself that is still honest enough to understand things clearly, that she is right, not partly right. Not right in the way that children are sometimes right about their parents in ways that are also unfair. Right in the full and accurate sense of the word, the kind of right that doesn't leave much room for negotiation or revision. But to tell you that, I have to start further back, because these things never begin where they appear to begin. I grew up in South Chicago, in a neighborhood that was working class in the specific and unglamorous way that working class means when there is no cushion beneath it. No savings account, no family member with a profession or a connection who might soften the edges of things when they go wrong. My father worked in a meatpacking plant for most of my childhood, and my mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and took in ironing the other days. And together they kept 5 children fed and clothed and in school, which was not a small achievement, and which I understood even as a boy required a kind of daily effort that left very little room for anything beyond itself. We were not an unhappy family. I want to say that clearly, because I think the story I'm about to tell can be mistaken for a story about an unhappy childhood. And it wasn't. There was warmth in our house, real warmth, the kind that comes from people who genuinely love each other, even when they are exhausted and worried, and running out of month before they run out of bills. My mother laughed easily and often. My father was a quiet man, not cold, just quiet, the kind of quiet that you understand later in life as the natural result of spending your days doing hard physical labor and your nights doing arithmetic that doesn't quite add up and that you mistake as a child for distance, when it is actually a form of presence that simply doesn't announce itself. What I absorbed from that household, as children absorb things, not through instruction, but through the slow accumulation of observation, was a very specific understanding of what a man's role in a family was. A man provided. That was the core of it. A man went out and worked and brought back what the family needed, and the measure of his success as a husband and father was the sufficiency of what he brought back. My father never said this to me directly. He didn't need to. It was written into the structure of every day I watched him live, into the way his shoulders relaxed slightly on Fridays when the week's work was done and the paycheck was in his hand, into the particular anxiety that settled over the house when work was slow or when an unexpected expense arrived. The equation was simple and legible, and I learned it thoroughly. A good man provides, and providing is how he loves. I carried that equation with me when I left Chicago at 18 to join the Navy, which was in 1960, and which felt at the time like the most significant decision I had ever made, which it probably was. The Navy gave me structure and discipline and a sense of competence that I hadn't previously had access to, and it also gave me 4 years of seeing enough of the world to understand that the world was considerably larger than South Chicago, which was both exhilarating and slightly disorienting in the way that an expanded horizon can be when you're not entirely sure yet who you are inside the larger picture. I came back to Chicago in 1964, got a job at a manufacturing company on the North Side doing production work, and within a year had met a woman named Carol at a dance at her cousin's house in Evanston. Carol was 22, a year younger than me, and she was the kind of woman who made a room feel organized simply by being in it, not in a controlling way, but in a way that suggested she had thought about things and arrived at sensible conclusions, and was at peace with those conclusions, which was a quality I found enormously attractive, because it was, at 23, so far from my own experience of myself, I was still largely improvising. Carol seemed to actually know what she was doing. We married in 1966, and our first son, Michael, was born in 1967. Then Kevin in 1969, then our daughter Diane in 1972, and finally our youngest Patricia in 1975. 4 children in 8 years, which meant that by the time I was in my mid-30s, I was supporting a family of 6 on a manufacturing salary that was decent by the standards of the time and insufficient by the standards of what 6 people actually require, which meant that the lesson I had learned in my father's house was now the central organizing principle of my own life. Provide. Work harder. Provide more. I was good at working. I want to be clear about that because I think it's an important part of the story. I was not a man who resented his obligations or who went to work grudgingly while secretly wishing he was somewhere else. I genuinely found satisfaction in the work, in the problem-solving of it, in the measurable relationship between effort and outcome that the manufacturing floor provided in a way that other parts of life did not. When a production problem got solved, you could see that it was solved. When output improved, the numbers reflected it. When you put in the extra hours and the results showed up in the paycheck, the connection between the two was clear and direct and deeply satisfying in a way I found it difficult to replicate anywhere else. I was promoted steadily through my 30s, moved from production into management by the time I was 35, and by 40 was running a division of the company that employed 40 people and had a budget that would have seemed incomprehensible to the boy from South Chicago who had watched his father count out grocery money on the kitchen table. The money was not extravagant, but it was sufficient, more than sufficient by the measure I had grown up with, and I felt the satisfaction of that sufficiency, the way I imagine my father felt it on Friday afternoons, as a kind of proof. Proof that I was doing what a man was supposed to do. Proof that my family would not know the particular anxiety of the thin margin. Proof that I was succeeding at the project I had assigned myself. Carol was a remarkable woman, and I say that now with a clarity and a gratitude that I did not always possess in the years when I should have been saying it more directly to her. She raised 4 children with a consistency and a warmth and a practical intelligence that I can only fully appreciate now, that I understand how much of it I left to her by default. She managed the house and the children's schedules and their school involvement and their medical appointments and their friendships and their difficulties and their small victories. All the dense and continuous work of keeping 4 human beings developing in healthy directions. And she did all of it while I was doing the thing I believed was my primary contribution, which was being at work. I was home. I want to say that because it's true and it matters to me that it's understood. I was not a man who abandoned his family, or who had no interest in his children, or who was actively absent in any dramatic sense. I came home every evening. I was at the dinner table most nights. I went to the important things, the graduations and the school plays, and the sports events that felt significant enough to mark on a calendar. I was present in the physical sense of the word with a consistency that I was, for a long time, proud of. What I was not was there. And I understand the difference between those two things much better now than I did then. When I came home in the evenings, I came home depleted in the way that a day of managing problems and people and pressures depletes a person. And what I needed in those hours between dinner and sleep was to decompress, to let the tension of the day drain away, to be in a space that didn't require me to solve anything, or decide anything, or perform any function beyond existing. Which meant that I sat in the living room and watched the news and read the paper and moved through those hours in a state of deliberate disengagement that I understood as rest and that my children, I know now, experienced as unavailability. Carol managed the transition between the workday Frank and the evening, Frank with a skill and a patience that I did not deserve and did not adequately acknowledge. She kept the children from interrupting me when I needed quiet. She handled the homework disputes and the sibling conflicts and the bedtime negotiations without pulling me into them unless something had escalated beyond what she could manage alone, which was rarely, because she was very capable. She created, around my decompression time, a protective structure that served my needs entirely, and that I accepted as the natural order of things because it was consistent with my understanding of how the arrangement was supposed to work. I provided the resources. She managed the household. These were separate and complementary functions, each essential, each respected in theory. The problem with that framework, and I understand this now in a way that took me decades longer than it should have, is that children don't need resources and household management as separate functions. They need parents, both of them, not as providers of different categories of support, but as people, actual people with interior lives and opinions and fears, and the capacity to be genuinely present. What my children got from me for most of their childhoods was a man who was reliably present in the building and genuinely elsewhere in almost every other sense. Michael, my oldest, understood this earliest and adapted to it most efficiently, which is to say he became, fairly early on, a boy who didn't expect much from me in the way of emotional engagement. He directed his need for that kind of engagement toward Carol and toward his own peer relationships, and who maintained with me a relationship that was warm but shallow. We talked about sports. We talked about his schoolwork in terms of grades and trajectory. We talked about practical matters, the car, money, plans. We did not talk about what was happening inside either of us, because I had not established that as a possibility between us, and he had understood, with the accuracy that children have about their parents' actual availability, that it was not on offer. Kevin, my second, was different in temperament from Michael, more internal, more prone to feelings that he struggled to articulate and that I struggled to acknowledge, because I had no reliable vocabulary for feelings that couldn't be resolved with a practical solution. Kevin went through a difficult period in his early teens, a sullenness that worried Carol. I addressed it, when I addressed it at all, with the only tools I had, which were variations on the theme of straightening up and applying yourself. Carol told me once, during that period, that Kevin needed me to sit with him, just sit with him, not fix anything or say anything particularly wise, just be there in a way that felt like genuine company. I didn't know how to do that. I'm not sure I believed it was a real category of need. So I didn't do it, and Kevin moved through that period on the strength of Carol's consistent attention and his own interior resources. He came out the other side fine, which I told myself was evidence that everything had worked out, when what it was actually evidence of was how little my contribution to the outcome had mattered. Diane, my daughter, was 13 when something shifted in our relationship in a way I didn't understand at the time and only partially understand now. She had been, as a younger child, openly affectionate with me in the way that small children are with their fathers when the fathers are present enough to receive affection. There had been a period when she was perhaps 8 or 9, when she would climb into my chair beside me in the evenings and lean against me while I read, which I allowed and which I found genuinely pleasant. The warm weight of her against my side, the comfortable silence of it, and then that stopped. Not all at once, but gradually, in the way that things stop when a child begins to internalize the subtle signals of what is and isn't welcome. I didn't notice it stopping until it had already stopped, and by then it was simply the new configuration, Diane slightly more self-contained around me, slightly more careful about what she offered, which I attributed to adolescence and did not examine further. Patricia, my youngest, was the one who told me at Christmas 2 years ago what she told me. She was always the most direct of my children, the one most likely to say the actual thing rather than the managed version of the actual thing, which Carol always said she got from me, which was both flattering and instructive about what directness costs a person when it isn't paired with availability. Patricia and I had a relationship that was affectionate and somewhat formal. Formal in the sense that there was always a slight awareness between us of what was and wasn't part of our established repertoire of interaction, and she had always operated within that repertoire with a good-natured competence, while simultaneously, I suspect, being very clear-eyed about its limitations. Carol died in 2017. She had a stroke in February, which was sudden enough to be shocking, despite the fact that she was 73 and had some health issues that, in retrospect, were warning signs that neither of us took seriously enough. She was in the hospital for 11 days, and she died on a Tuesday morning, with Michael and Diane in the room and me holding her hand, and the loss of her was of a magnitude that I did not have any framework to contain. I had known, in an abstract sense that I had never examined very closely, that Carol was the person around whom my life was organized. But I had not understood, until she was gone, how completely and how specifically that was true, or how much of what I understood as my own competence in the world was actually her competence, operating continuously and mostly invisibly in the background of every day I'd lived for 50 years. She had managed not just the household, but the social fabric of our family, the birthdays remembered and the relationships maintained, and the tone set at gatherings and the difficult conversations navigated, and the grandchildren's personalities understood and responded to with individual care. She had been, in every sense that I was beginning to understand mattered, the actual center of our family's life. And I had been, for most of that life, the man at work who made it financially possible for her to be that center. The year after she died was the hardest year of my life. And I say that having lived through things that I would previously have considered harder. The difficulty was not only grief, though the grief was real and serious, and unlike anything I had previously experienced. The difficulty was the sudden and total exposure of how unprepared I was to exist in my own life without her managing it. I didn't know which neighbors I could call in an emergency. I didn't know the names of the people at the church she had been involved with for 30 years. I didn't know how she had organized the family gatherings, who was responsible for what the unspoken agreements were about, where holidays were held, and how long they lasted, and what food appeared, and why. I didn't know, in some fundamental sense, how to be in my own family without her as the intermediary. My children stepped in their different ways, to help manage what I couldn't manage, and in doing so, they also, without intending to, showed me something about myself that I had not previously seen so clearly. They helped me the way you help someone who is unfamiliar with a system they should have been part of all along, with patience and without accusation, but with a slight undertone of something that I identified, over time, as the particular kindness that adult children extend to a parent they love and have never fully known. I retired about a year after Carol died, earlier than I had planned, because the work that had organized my life for 40 years suddenly felt, in her absence, like a habit without a purpose. The framework was still there, but the thing it had been built to support was gone, and what remained was the strange experience of a man sitting in a large house full of the furniture of a shared life, trying to figure out what he was for. It was during that period that I began, slowly and without much natural aptitude, to actually think about my children as people, not as the children I had provided for, not as the evidence of a family successfully maintained, but as actual individuals with interior lives that I had been adjacent to for decades without ever fully entering. I called them more, not to check in the efficient way I had always checked in, running through a quick assessment of how things were going in the major categories: work, health, the grandchildren, practical concerns, but to actually talk. And what I discovered in those conversations was that I had a great deal to learn about people I had known their entire lives. Michael, I learned, had struggled with anxiety for most of his adult life, quietly and without making much of it, and that the self-sufficiency I had always admired in him was partly genuine, and partly the result of having understood from an early age that certain kinds of need were not available to be expressed in our household. Kevin had thought seriously about a different kind of life than the one he had wanted at one point to study music, had let that go without much discussion, because the discussion didn't feel possible. Diane had carried, for years, a complicated feeling about her relationship with me that she had managed with characteristic competence without ever quite resolving, and that included a grief for something she had wanted from me as a child, that she had eventually stopped expecting and learned to live without. Patricia told me all of this, or most of it, over a series of conversations in the 2 years after Carol died, with the directness that was her nature, and she told me not to hurt me, but because she is a woman who believes that honesty, even when it is difficult, is a form of respect. And I sat with what she told me, and I recognized in it the truth that I had been moving toward without fully arriving at, the truth that being a good provider and being a present father were not the same thing, had never been the same thing, and that I had spent 40 years excelling at one while convincing myself it covered the other. That Christmas 2 years ago, we were at Patricia's house, the whole family. And after dinner, while the grandchildren were doing whatever grandchildren do in the next room, and they, adults, were sitting around the table with their coffee, she said what she said. "Dad, I know everything about what you did for us, and almost nothing about who you are." She said it without cruelty and without the energy of an accusation. She said it the way someone states a fact that has been true for a long time and that they've decided, finally, to say out loud because saying it seems more honest than continuing not to say it. The table was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, but significant. A truth everyone recognized, unsure what to do with. Michael looked at his coffee. Kevin looked at me. Diane put her hand on my arm, a gesture not made in years. I felt its force. I didn't know what to say. 40 years of work, where every problem had a response. Now, no response, no action at her table. I said, "You're right," all I had. In its inadequacy, it felt like the most honest thing I'd said in a long time. We talked for a long time that evening, after the grandchildren slept. A conversation I hadn't had with my children, all 4, in 80 years. Not a managed conversation, not about practical family business. An actual conversation about actual things, about who we were to each other, about who we had been, what was lost when I was working, and what might still be possible in the years I had left. I'm not going to tell you that conversation fixed everything. That would be an ending that makes a story feel complete. Real life generally isn't, but something shifted that evening, a shift I've felt since. My children know more about me now. Not everything, perhaps not enough, but more. I've told them things about my own childhood I never thought to tell them before. About my father, what I understood from watching him, the equation I inherited and applied for 40 years. I've asked them questions about their own lives I should have been asking for decades. I've tried, with the clumsy social equipment of an 81-year-old, to actually listen to the answers. My granddaughter, Patricia's youngest, is 11 years old. Her name is Sophie. She has her mother's directness and her grandmother Carol's way of laughing with her whole face. She calls me Grandpa Frank and talks to me in a way her parents, at her age, did not. She tells me about her friends, opinions, and fears in the unguarded way of a child. And I sit with her, actually sit with her, without my phone, without the news, without the hum of what needs to be handled. I ask her questions, and I mean them. She answers, and I hear. I understand something about presence, something I should have understood 50 years ago and didn't. I think about my father a great deal now. What would he have said if Patricia said that to him? If one of his 5 children told him they knew everything he'd done, but nothing about who he was, I think he would have understood it. He knew it was true, a fact about his life's shape, accepted without examining, because examination felt like a luxury, a deviation from his path. The path, a man's job, secure what his family needs. Securing is the love. Love is the securing. I followed that path faithfully for 40 years. It wasn't entirely wrong. The security was real. My children's lives were materially better for it in ways not trivial, but the path was incomplete. What was missing cannot be provided by a paycheck, college fund, or safe neighborhood. Something given directly, person to person, in the unremarkable daily moments of a shared life. I did not give enough of it. The people who needed it built their lives around its absence, with a resilience I admire, and that I also, when honest, grieve. Grief, not regret exactly, though regret is there too. Grief for what was not given. For versions of my children at 7, 12, 15, 22, I did not know well enough. Now grown into adults, who carry whatever that unknowing cost them, efficiently and without complaint. They are good people, my children. Whatever they became, largely through their own efforts and Carol's attention. The goodness in them reflects well on their mother. I see clearly now what she was doing all those years. I am proud of them with a specificity and genuineness I did not always have access to. Pride not rooted in actual knowledge is thin. I've been learning to know my children well enough. I am 81 years old. I have a limited, unspecified amount of time remaining. What I am trying to do with that time, I wouldn't have known how to name 10 years ago. I am trying to be known. Not in a grand sense, not a finished product, but in the quiet, ongoing sense of showing up as the actual person I am. Allowing them, if willing, to do the same. It is harder than it sounds for a man my age with my formation. I've spent 80 years being competent. Being not competent, uncertain, in the middle of something I haven't figured out, feels uncomfortable. I suspect it wouldn't feel as uncomfortable if I had practiced it more when younger. But I am practicing it now, both later than it should be and not as late as it could be. My children are more willing to meet me in that practice than I had any right to expect. Patricia called me last week on a Thursday evening for no particular reason. She just called to talk. We talked for almost an hour about things I cannot now remember with any specificity. Her week, something her kids said, a book, a memory of Carol, a question about our last conversation. An ordinary phone call, the kind that happens between people who know each other, who find the company valuable enough to seek without an occasion. I hung up and sat in my living room in the quiet of a Thursday evening. I thought about all the Thursday evenings across the years when a call like that might have happened and didn't, because I hadn't made the space for it or shown the interest that would have invited it. I let that thought sit without trying to do anything with it. Then I thought about the fact that it had happened now, this particular Thursday. That seemed like something to be genuinely grateful for. I am not going to tell you that I have it figured out. I don't. I am an 81-year-old man learning, later than I should have, about being a person in relation to others. The learning is uneven, sometimes awkward, and I make mistakes regularly. But I am doing it, which is more than I was doing for most of the years I was supposed to. My children, with a generosity I find humbling and clarifying, are letting me. If you are a man who recognizes something of yourself in what I've described, I am not asking you to feel bad. Feeling bad is not useful. I've wasted enough time feeling bad myself. The value, if any, is in looking clearly at what you've built and what you've left out. Asking if there's still time to add what's missing, and then, if there is, actually doing that. Not dramatically. Just by showing up a little more each day as the actual person you are, to the actual people in front of you, and letting that be enough. My father was a quiet man who loved his family, expressed through consistency of provision. I understood that as a child and replicated it as an adult. He'd recognize himself in my story, more comforting to him than clarifying to me. But he'd understand what Patricia said. The distance between what you give and what people need is one men of our formation are slow to recognize, and slower still to cross. I am crossing it at 81 in the late afternoon of things. It is slower going. The terrain is less familiar than I'd like. I am doing it without Carol. She would have known exactly what to say at every difficult moment, and she is not here. But I am doing it, and my children are there on the other side of it, waiting with a patience I did not earn, and a love that has survived, intact and genuine. A long time of not being fully received. That is more than I deserve, and I am trying, every day that I have left, to be worthy of it.